Welcome, everybody, to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start. This session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link to it from our website at ICSSmarx.org within the next few days. In fact, we want to wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening because we now have program attendees from throughout the United States and around the world. My name is Alan Miller, and I will be hosting this meeting. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, and I would like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, and suggestions for topics and speakers. You can contact us through our contact form on our website, ICSSmarx.org. For over a decade and a half, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library has been a platform for presentations on a variety of topics, such as political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, supporting the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism, militarism and war, environmental movement, and the fight for racial and gender justice. In pre-pandemic times, our weekly program was hosted at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, we have met every Sunday on Zoom. This program is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed are those of the participants. They do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Today, we're going to have a discussion, a short presentation, and a discussion about recent events in Ukraine. And we'll go for about half hour or so presentation by Richard Fallenbaum, followed by a break for announcements and then a question and answer period. So just want to welcome everybody once again, and let's get started. Richard, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn off my video so that you don't have to watch me read my notes and fidget around, but I'll be here. And the topic of my presentation is Ukraine, but and the class struggle and class struggle. And first of all, I think it's in the international arena, and I think it's important to look at the different views of international relations. And basically, there are only two views of international relations. There only can be in the current period, the bourgeois view and the proletarian view. So I want to run through a little bit about those two views and contrast them and make some observations, and then end up with the specific case of the Ukraine. So I'm going to start with the bourgeois view of international relations. And it's based on the bourgeois view of the nation state. I start talking about class struggle. Well, in the bourgeois view, there is no class struggle. In society, there are no classes because there are no classes. The bourgeois does not accept the idea that there are separate classes. Society consists only of individuals. The individuals have certain individual rights, autonomy, freedom, the kind of stuff that's in the Constitution. He meets his fellow citizens in the market to exchange goods and services on an equal basis. And in the political system, he also meets his fellow citizens on the basis of equality. The task of the state in national life is to defend the freedom of the individual. This is the ideology of the bourgeoisie. And in the international sphere, it's based on that general theory, except that instead of the individual being the kind of irreducible atom, the nation state is the basic unit. The nation has certain inalienable rights. Similarly, sovereignty, secure borders, all nations are equal, all nations meet each other equally in the international arena. They trade freely and so forth for their own mutual benefit. This is the ideology, very roughly, and of the bourgeois system of. It's not necessarily the reality; it's the ideology. A good example of the ideology of the bourgeois is the application of it is the Monroe Doctrine, which people justifiably are skeptical about, but as it stands alone, it's very good. It says the United States will defend the Western Hemisphere from attack from the colonial powers of Europe. We all know that the reality turned out to be quite a bit different, but the ideology of imperialism was a noble one, if you take it on its face value. On the other hand, I want to go on to the Marxist ideology of international relationship. In contrast to the bourgeois idea of no classes, the Marxist idea that the history of society of all societies in history is class struggle, and that the nation state, far from being the basic unit of international relations, is an artificial construction to support the capitalist class domination. The Marxist view is that the proletariat has no country. His loyalty is to the working class globally. The slogan of the communist movement is "Workers of the world unite." That's not. It was only later changed to "Workers of all countries unite," which is an ambiguous slogan. Workers of the world unite against the capitalist of the world. At any rate, the logical expression of that idea, that Marxist theory put forward by Marx and Lenin later, was the Communist International, the Comintern, which was basically the World Communist Party, on whose structure every national Communist Party and every individual communist was part and subject to its discipline. It was sort of an upgrade of the way the Catholic Church functions, with the center in Rome and the Vatican, and the national, the whole thing. So and the Communist International was a great success. It allocated resources, and it helped around the world from all countries, from all elements of the Communist International to wherever they were needed internationally. It provided support for communist movement and guidance for the communist movements in every country, and it had a great impact. I think it was arguably crucial to the revolution in China, revolution in Vietnam, South Africa, the not complete revolution, but it had an impact positive on the United States too. Nevertheless, the Communist International was dissolved in 1943, and everybody wants, why was it done? Some people will say, well, it just proves what a bad guy Stalin was. But I think it was something else. I think that the dissolution of the Communist International represented a strategic evaluation and decision that the class struggle could more effectively be waged on the terrain of bourgeois principles than proletarian internationalism. That is, that it could, so I'm just leave it at that. Incidentally, I think Stalin's greatest diplomatic triumph was the establishment of the United Nations, which he and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, negotiated during the war. FDR was kind of the last radical bourgeois political leader in the United States. And the UN Charter expresses the classic bourgeois values of international relations, equality, sovereignty, inviolability of borders, peace among nations, bans the use of force, etc. And here's the interesting part. Paradoxically, the socialist countries are the main defenders of the United Nations and the bourgeois principles of international relations, while the capitalist states, particularly the biggest one, the United States, violates it every day. So interesting. We can talk about it in the discussion some more. Interestingly enough, the Russian government today, under Putin and the foreign minister Lavrov, proclaim the principle of the de-ideological, I can't pronounce it. Anyway, taking ideology out of foreign policy. That's their principle. Well, of course, I just want to comment, you can't take ideology out. There's an ideology. I think what they really mean is they're taking proletarian internationalism out of foreign policy, and they're functioning on the basis of bourgeois ideals. And so that's what I want to lay out, what I think is what's happening in the world today. Furthermore, I think China is taking the same line as the Russians. They've de-ideologized their foreign relations. It's win-win, which is a perfect concept, bourgeois concept of international relations. It's not the victory of the working class over the capitalist class. It's win-win relationship between different states. So Russia and China defend bourgeois principles, and the United States and its flunkies trample on them all the time. And that's where the world proletariat carries on the struggle internationally. We're not at ICSS. We have no responsibility. We can talk about the world situation bluntly in Marxist terms. So let's do that, and let's do that in terms of the issue today of Ukraine. And I think first of all we should talk about NATO and what happened in Europe after World War II. The origin, the function of NATO in the imperialist, capitalist world system was the function was set up as a military organization. It's part of the function was first to destroy socialism and in the USSR and Eastern Europe, and to open up those areas for plunder, straight out. And the second was to occupy Western Europe, to prevent the working class taking power in the rest of Europe, not only in Germany, where the occupation forces, US occupation and British occupation forces first landed, but throughout France, Italy, Britain, all the other countries, which and certainly at that time were there was a strong workers' movement, and where the hold of the bourgeoisie in those countries was shaky. And it's it's not totally a military occupation. It has important political aspects too that we could go into, but it's a political military occupation of Europe. Now, sometimes the question comes up is, why did NATO expand to Eastern Europe, the former socialist states, the former parts of the Soviet Union? But the real question is, how could they not? The capital rule, the rule of capital in the formerly socialist states was never stabilized. It could only be stabilized by occupation, by foreign military occupation, and especially true of the former republics of the Soviet Union, which many of them have never been capitalist, where the capitalist class had never dominated. So it was almost obligatory for the capitalists to occupy those countries in every way they could. So they not only set up puppet governments, but they occupied them militarily. So which brings us to Ukraine itself, which had not been completely capitalized, let's put it that way, and was threatening to possibly go back into the orbit of Russia. So the overthrow of the Ukrainian state in 2014 was a typical US imperial regime change operation. There are some specifics, and we can talk about it in the discussion, and people might have a lot more information. but we can just sketch it out. Obama and his cronies bragged that they spent $5 billion in bribes, propaganda to overthrow the Ukrainian government. They used extremist shock troops from around the world, not only domestic Nazis, but Nazis. There's a kind of mini Nazi international network of Nazis around the world, and many of them, quite a few of them were brought in. They were brought in from some of the other states in Eastern Europe. There were probably Islamic extremists brought in. NATO special forces were brought in that were which were battered down the Ukrainian state after it had been weakened by the regime change operation. The most militant, the strongest opposition to that takeover was from the most militant sections of the Ukrainian proletariat, which was the industrial workers of what is now the People's Republics of the Donbass. It's true that they speak Russian mostly, but and there's certainly a national aspect to the resistance in the Donbass and in the Crimea, but it represents the actually it's a proletarian resistance, and we have to assume that there is resistance in a NATO-occupied Ukraine, because, as I said, Ukraine lived under socialism for 75 years. That is, the working class held power, state power in the Ukraine for 75 years. There's obviously a proletariat, a class-conscious proletariat in the Ukraine also, and they're resisting. But we don't know much about it. There's massive repression in the Ukraine, incessant propaganda, the denial of bourgeois rights, straight-out terrorism, so forth. The NATO program being put forth to complete the conquest of the Ukraine, basically to kill, to expel, or to repress the populations of the Ukraine that are not under their control, namely the Donbass and the Crimea. It's sort of like the conquest of the Kosovo during the Yugoslav regime change operation. As I said, I'm assuming that there is resistance in the rest of Ukraine, but the main thing is that we can observe is the mass emigration of Ukrainians from those areas, just as there have been in every imperial regime change operation in the last 20 or 30 years. More than a million people emigrated to Russia, and a similar amount have emigrated to the Western powers. I just want to say one other word. Just the resistance in the other Eastern European countries. There is a proletariat in all those countries that lived under socialism, if only for 35, 45 years. That is where the working class held power. We don't know much about it, but it exists in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Bulgaria, in Romania. All those countries have a proletarian struggle. The class struggle is going on in those countries, and we shouldn't ignore it. So, and I'm sure the communists who were able to are watching that very carefully, the developments in all those countries, and trying to help them as much as they can. In terms of, say, Russia or China, they're doing it within the confines, within the framework of bourgeois ideology and the bourgeois system, but they're doing it nevertheless. Anyway, I want to end there and open it up to discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I just want to remind everybody that today's session, unlike most of our sessions, is really centered around discussion. And the idea is not that Richard is presenting, as he said, as an expert, but more like leading a discussion, throwing out some ideas and asking people to respond. So with that in mind, what I would really encourage people to do, if not require, is for people to raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button and pose your questions, make your statement, and let's try to get a good discussion here about this really important issue. So with that being said, let's get started. A bunch of hands went up before I could note who raised their hand first. So I'm just going to go down the list. Let's start off with Sharon. Sharon, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. That was a really good start of a discussion. Historically speaking, though, you mentioned the demise of the Comintern as one factor in how what led to the present situation where we have both Russia and China taking the bourgeois approach to foreign relations. I wanted to say a couple of things about that. So we shouldn't forget in the post-war, the history of the post-war world, the role of the non-aligned movement. At one point, it was very strong, and it was made up of different forces from all around the world, Africa and Latin America and other places. And it played a very strong role in struggles in the United Nations and in other places. And the bourgeoisie, the international capitalists could not tolerate it, so they managed to destroy it. And I think the last leader of that movement was Gaddafi, who was murdered by the United States because, in my opinion, because he was trying to revive or at least a part of the non-aligned movement. He was elected the chair of the African, the Organization of African States. And he had a lot of good ideas and plans for wielding more power from that organization internationally. The demise of the organized non-aligned movement, in my opinion, was a great loss to the international proletariat. I also wanted to say that I don't think that the foreign policy of China, of the People's Republic of China, has always been supporting bourgeois ideas, bourgeois relationships. For quite a long time, the Chinese Communist Party and the state were materially supporting revolutionary struggles around the world. And it wasn't only Zhou Enlai, but it certainly was he who led that way of dealing internationally. So I don't know when, we can only speculate about exactly how that changed, and probably different ones of us have different views on that, but change in Chinese policy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, Sharon, I just want a follow-up question. How do you tie this into the Ukraine? What's going, not into Ukraine, what's going on?
Well, what Richard said about the role of international capital in bringing Ukraine to this point is very valid. I think we can look at the way in which, sorry, that phone is ringing. I can't stop it. Let's see. I think that you can look at other situations in Europe that mirror that, what happened with the role of NATO. So German capital, with the help of the United States and others, intervened and whipped up the flames of ethnic differences to break up Yugoslavia. I think that's a similar kind of a similar situation. And what Richard, I was just trying to amplify on what Richard said about that it's now China and Russia who are upholding bourgeois international relations, whereas the US and its flunkies are flaunting it and not following their own rules, or the rules that they voted to establish.
Okay, thank you. Next is Richard, followed by Jean, Yusuf, and then Raj. And I encourage people to raise your hand. This is a discussion today, so please go ahead and chime in. Richard, if you would unmute yourself. Richard W. There's a lot of Richards.
Of course. Discuss. Yeah, I had a couple of things I noted. The first thing was that Richard, is that you made something about the bourgeois didn't recognize class struggle, and I think I disagree with that. I think that they recognize very well class struggle. The problem is that they recognize their interests in this on this side. I think in part that that they recognize where their interest in this lies, and their interest lies in them maintaining control of decision making over productive resources. In that sense, it harkens back to the original concept of what we're looking at as political economy. And I think what you're looking at is the economy part. I think that in large measure, we're also leaving out the political part, which inherited a lot from feudalism. The second issue that I had was on NATO. And yeah, NATO was originally brought up as a quote sort of a response to the Soviet, but I think in large measure it's really become much more of an economic organization. And in that sense, it's become it's really about selling weapons. And so you invite countries into NATO in order to enlarge your market share. So it's as much, if not more, about I think we have a national product, a national industry, and that is the weapons industry. And in some sense, we're in competitions with the Russians on that. I mean, you look at all these air shows and all these military conventions, and it's the Russians selling their weapon system versus the United States selling their weapon systems versus the British selling their weapon systems versus the French. So it's really much more about an economic marketplace as much as anything. And the third thing is in Ukraine, it strikes me, I sort of mentioned this before this whole thing started. I was listening to Fareed Zakaria, and he's not alone in this. I can't help but think that in large measure, the United States' use of intelligence is really about getting us prepared for war. I mean, it's I keep thinking in terms of what is it, Operation? It's the Free Spirit, I think, where the United States and South Korea keep rushing towards the North Korean border, and just to sort of test their defenses. I can't help but think that we're witnessing the same kind of thing here, in that what we're getting is our collective mindset is being prepared for war. Either in Ukraine or versus Russians or ultimately in China. So with that, I'll shut up and turn it back over. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Next is Jean. And again, I want to urge people to press the reactions button, raise your hand, followed by Yusuf and then Raj. So Jean.
I forgot to unmute myself and show myself, so you get to see me also. But, well, thank you, Richard. This was difficult, and this is a very important thing because there are two areas primarily that could lead to nuclear war and nuclear annihilation, and Ukraine is one of them. But I'm wearing my Vets for Peace hat today because we take a different approach that is not just discussion, but it's more in line with Marxist principle. We don't merely need to understand the world, we need to change it. And that's the purpose of Veterans for Peace, is the abolishment of war. And we had a session yesterday, and we came up with a statement on this. It's under 100 words, so I just want to read it and let people see what a practical solution to the problem in Ukraine and elsewhere is. It's titled, "On the Crisis in Ukraine, Bring Our Troops Home, US Out of Eurasia, Abolish NATO." And 4 points. First of all, there's a joint statement of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on international relations entering a new era and the global sustainable development. And this is when Xi Jinping and Putin got together at the Winter Olympics. And this is the statement. It's 5,000 words. I commend people to read that at their leisure, and I have to confess that I've only been able to scan it. Point number 2, the US funded pro-Nazi Maidan revolution of 2014 constituted an existential threat to Russia. 3, there is no evidence that Russia plans to attack Ukraine. And 4, our position is simply, as I said, bring our troops home, US out of Eurasia, and abolished NATO. And back in the day, I was among the people that protested the war in Vietnam, and our saying was basically, get the hell out of Vietnam. And that's continues to be our position in terms of what's going on in Ukraine. So I just wanted to put that out, and people can talk about it or not if they want to, but I think it is in keeping with Marx's statement that our point is not simply to talk about the world, but to change it. Thank you.
Okay, next is Yusuf, if you would unmute yourself and go ahead and make your comment.
Okay, thank you. Yes, let me. I actually have many comments, but this time around, let me go to the issue of communist parties. There is a international conference of workers and of communist and workers parties that meets regularly. The communist parties of China, DPRK, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba we regularly attend them. The Communist Party of China, in somewhat different, separate from the politics of the state policy, country policy. It has a vibrant, actually, international activity with a communist party, other communist parties. And now that the Sino-Soviet split is forgotten by any sane person, it has wide ties. Such international communist solidarity does exist. Some countries in this international conference are represented by a single party, as the US, but some by one or more, like Turkey. The international communist movement is not that. China participated. Let me add that China, with the blessings of the party, there's a academic project in China of the histories of the communist parties of various countries. And I sort of helped in regard to Turkey on this matter. So the Chinese, well, anyway, so let me end my comments here. I'll wait for the other round, on other topics.
Thank you. Also, I just wanted to mention Richard Fallenbaum, if you wish to interject on any of these, go right ahead. Just chime in. Next is Raj, followed by Janet. So Raj, if you would unmute yourself and ask your.
Okay, I really like Richard's presentation. I think acceptance of capitalism as ideology, not only ideology, but also capitalism as a production system and relations of production in all these countries, China, Russia, of course, Western Europe, United States already had it. Also in India, it's moving forward more and more. It always was, but it was somewhat restrained. So I think the issue has become that of these competing blocks emerging. Now, because they all need the market, they all have to sell their product, they have to make profit. And And so United States historically has played the role of an imperialist, and it is penultimate imperialist even now, but it is weakened. It does not have the capacity to enter a war in Europe against a country like Russia. Russians, on the other hand, have a big issue with NATO. NATO, which is at their doorstep, and weapons, can reach Moscow and their targets. So it's a very important issue that if NATO is there, I mean, of course, we would not want NATO to be there, but it's not our wish that prevails. The reality is NATO is there. But at least NATO weapons and NATO should not be right adjacent Russia. I think that's a very legitimate demand. And this whole idea that every country should be free to join or not join NATO as long as they qualify is, of course, a hypocritical statement by the United States, because why they didn't practice in Cuba. Cuba had a right to put missiles for self-defense when Soviets were putting there, and they said, no, not in our backyard. Russia, but now they're singing a different tune. So that's totally hypocritical. And so one big issue is Russia's own security, which is very valid. They have been attacked twice, and given enormous lives were lost. And I don't blame Putin to make sure this doesn't happen again. So for him to demand that there not be NATO adjacent is perfectly valid. And on Ukraine, there's a further complication, which is there was a Minsk agreement, as Richard has pointed out. Donetsk Basin, that's an industrial area where people were more subconscious, as Richard pointed out, of class consciousness, but also they feel more comfortable with Mother Russia than with the system that the United States engineered, which is, I don't know if you call it fascism, but it's pretty nasty kind of system. So these are two major issues. And there, the Ukrainian government is emboldened to say, well, we're not comfortable with Minsk agreement. In other words, they want to violate the Minsk agreement. And that means that Russia has to abandon those people, and the Ukrainians can then send forces and suppress the people there and lord over them. And that would not be acceptable to Russians, and I think rightly so. So it's a complex picture, but the background of it is really what Richard said. It is that fall of the Soviet Union has opened the door for all this reaction to be taken advantage of by the United States. So I think in this case, US propaganda is absolutely nothing other than propaganda about it. Now, I won't preclude the possibility that Russians may they certainly are putting pressure on Ukraine to know that they cannot be defended by anybody. If Russia attacks them, they're going to be done for. So they better agree to working with Russia, and that's the message he's sending. Putin's sending. Whether he's going to invade I don't know, but it's not what I don't think Putin's intent is. So the fault lies almost entirely on US alliance in this case. And yet US alliance, I don't think is prepared to go to war. So I really don't know. I think this is really muddle-headedness on part of the United States to try to act as an imperial power when their forces they're not able to, in terms of militarily. They may have a lot of weapons, they cannot use it. They will not send soldiers. So what are you going to do? So Russians will send their soldiers. And Ukraine would not be able to withstand if that happened. So the whole American policy is really I don't think it's viable. But I also don't know. And Richard, you may want to comment. What is Putin's intent, if you know? Thank you.
about Russia, about the United States not being prepared to attack from your mouth, Raj.
No, I'm saying,
From your mouth to God's ears, yes.
yeah. No, but my question
That's all. I agree with you.
Yeah, my question to Richard is, what is Putin trying to do here? You know, I don't know if it's true, but they said the Ukraine is surrounded on 3 sides. There's no independent verification. I don't know if it's all propaganda or partly propaganda. There's certainly a maneuver. So, Richard, what's your opinion of that?
Richard, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I think the Russians want to prevent an attack on the Donbass. That they're open. That's it. And the United States would like to create a situation where they can step up the war against Russia, economic, political, and so forth, and create the image that the Russians have attacked. As I said, some other people, they already claim that the Russians have attacked. The Russians attack, according to imperialism, the Russians attacked the Donbass, invaded the Donbass. They're occupying the Donbass. They invaded and annexed, according to the Americans, the Crimea, even though the 90% of the population or more voted to secede from that non-existent state at the time when there was no state in the Donbass, in the Ukraine. The Ukrainian state was overthrown. So there was no state until they reconstituted. And so the Crimeans seceded very democratically. So, yeah. So that's
Just a quick one, if Alan would allow me.
Yeah,
Just to follow up.
please.
So my question is, one other objective is, do you see the objective of blocking the integration of German economy with the Russian economy through gas, which they're trying to do? They're afraid of their alliance falling apart and Germany becoming integrated with, Russia and Germany economy getting integrated. Is that the fear why United States is promoting all this? Is that part of it? Yeah.
Of course, if Germany becomes independent of US imperialism and integrates with Russia and China, then it's on the road to socialism too. Then the working class, the capitalists are much defenseless in Germany, and the working class has a chance to take over, not completely defenseless. So that's the class aspect of that relation. You can look at it in national terms, but there's a class terms, and as you know, Raj, I view Russia and China as the main node of working class power in the world today. So, it's a very tricky problem now to tell who's who, because we have mixed economies, we have mixed ideologies, and so forth. So one country could be proclaiming bourgeois ideals and not really believe in them or not really practice them, and another one does, and while actually being Marxist and proletarian. And so you have to disentangle all those things. So I'll leave it there. Let the other people speak.
Okay, next is Janet, if you would unmute yourself and make your statement. I just want to remind everybody that we can address questions to the group too. This is more of a discussion. So Janet, if you would unmute you're unmuted. Go ahead and proceed.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not going to do my video. So I have a number of points and questions. First, I'll start with Richard's description of the bourgeoisie versus proletariat when it comes to individual rights. I think he was saying that they have different positions, and bourgeoisie is more about individual rights. To me, it's more about property rights. That's what the issue between the two are. Also, the UN, I mean, it's a pretty weak organization, and it's probably, I mean, it tends to be Western in its orientation, but human rights is also a large part of the UN Charter. And I was wondering what position Richard thinks that or anybody thinks that the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat take on human rights. So that's one issue. And then the rest is about the Ukraine. Should I go into that now, or wait for?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and ask your question. Go ahead.
Just continue?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So when it comes to the Ukraine, all right. So I recently befriended, and I was talking a little bit about this before the webinar started. I befriended a couple, so it's a new friendship, who emigrated to the US from the Ukraine in 1989, and they were in their 60s or anyway. And so they had spent all their life, adult life, as Soviets. They were part of Ukraine was part of the USSR, and they emigrated at that time also. They were not happy in the USSR, although they had careers and all that. And in any case, so I've been learning from their perspective, and they were from Odessa, which is in the east of Ukraine. They speak Russian. And they know, I mean, there is a Ukrainian history and culture from before the Soviet Union. I mean, it's, and I'm wanting to learn more about the Ukraine, and the discussions and what I've been reading, etc., about what's happening around the Ukraine. There's not, it's focused on what Russia's motives are, what NATO's motives are, etc. Well, what about the Ukraine? I think we need to learn more about its long history and culture. So I mean, one of the things that I understand, but I don't understand completely, is that during the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had nuclear weapons, and they gave them up. And they gave them up in exchange for Russia to have a base in Crimea, in a Crimean port. I don't remember the name of it. And then the Russians took advantage of that. And the whole, the vote on Crimea, that's another story that it seems that the West has its own interpretation of that vote. And I'm learning that that's a little different from what I had learned from general discussion about that vote. Also, what happened in 2014. So, in any case, I didn't know about this webinar in enough time to invite the friends. I don't know if they would have come to this discussion, but I'm looking forward to learning more from them. So I'll stop there.
Can I can't find the thing to raise my hand, so can I be put on the list, please?
Do you want to, what I was going to ask is for people to respond, not just Richard, but just in general, if people want to respond to the comments and question that Janet just raised. Is that what you'd like to do, Nina?
No, actually, there was something said, I mean, just on the local national press, the United States press, about why Russia is doing this to the Ukraine that was, maybe of interest, which is just that they had more freedom of speech there in Ukraine. I don't know if that's true, but Putin didn't like that, didn't want that as a model for Russia. That's one thing they said. So since democracy has been a recent topic of this group, you guys don't believe in democracy, but there are people who do, and evidently this is what they're putting forth. The U.S. Media interpretation, one of them, that they wanted. They didn't want Ukraine around as a place that was more democratic and more open regarding the press, et cetera, than Russia. And that's it.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask people to do, we do have a couple of hands up, but I would like people to respond to Janet and to Nina's comments, kind of on the similar issue. I think Nina was trying to address the question of what motivates U.S. involvement and Russian involvement. But if people please chime in, I'd like people to chime in. Go ahead. You don't even need to raise your hand.
Well, actually, I could give a quick history from. I think I'm sort of interested in that part of the world. Well, actually, the first Rus state was formed in Kiev. They were originally a Scandinavian dynasty that became Slavicized.
Can you give some years, please?
What?
Can you give some years, please?
Oh, this was in the Middle Ages, 9th century, something like that, 9th or 10th century. Later, I don't have the years. The state expanded to the north later. The center of gravity moved north to Novgorod, and it was only after the Mongol period that Moscow became the center. Actually, they were the princes of Moscow were originally tax collectors for the Mongols, and through that they became powerful. And when the Mongol power waned, Russia expanded under Moscow. Ukrainian and Russian are quite close languages.
Mm-hmm.
In regards to more recent events, when the Soviet Union was formed, the regions of Donbass was the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, which is more Russian. And the term that was frequently used at the time was Great Russian, referring to the Russians, and Little Russians, referring to the Ukrainians. It was made part of Ukraine because to give Ukraine a more proletarian character. That was where the industries along the Black Sea coast was in Odessa. Crimea was part of Russia, the Russian Federation, Federative Soviet Socialist Republic, and then to give the Ukrainian state less of a peasant and more of a proletarian character. Now, Crimea was under Khrushchev was by a decision that bypassed the legal proper procedure under the Soviet Union, was made part of Crimea, and the excuse was that this was more convenient in coordinating certain economic projects. Now, the Crimea, when the Ukrainian state was formed, Crimea was an autonomous republic. Autonomous republics had the constitutional right to secede, and that's what they exercised. And after seceding, they very shortly after applied to become part of the Russian Federation. There was also an uprising against the fascist U.S. installed fascist regime in Odessa that was bloodily suppressed by fascist gangs. So does that sort of give you a little, I know it's a whole lot of history compressed, but I think that's a very basic summary.
Can I comment?
Yeah, sure.
Please go ahead.
So that what the previous speaker just said about that the more recent history, I don't think that that's the same as what I heard from my friends. But anyway.
Well, the Ukrainian don't. They go into some technicalities of the constitution and reject that.
Well, right. That's why I think we need to hear more from the Ukrainians.
Yeah, but I think there's the legal niceties or lawyers' tricks aside. There is the basic principle of self-determination, and they didn't want to live under the fascist regime. If they Ukraine hadn't taken a fascist turn, they wouldn't have seceded. Similarly, there was a mass anti-Russian hysteria banning Ukrainian and Russian were two official languages. There was a move to the new U.S. installed state, and look, the U.S. ambassador is caught on tape, hand-picking who should be president of Ukraine. So there was a revolt in the more Russian and more proletarian and more progressive regions against the fascist state and this extreme Ukrainian nationalism that the regime, the new regime, promoted.
And what about the nuclear weapons that?
Oh yes, that's a good point. And an important point. Now, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the many Soviet nuclear weapons were in the Ukraine, making in effect Ukraine, I think, something like the fourth or fifth major nuclear huh?
I think the third nuclear.
Okay, third. Nuclear power. So Ukraine voluntarily gave up those missiles, and in exchange asked for it took found a position of neutrality and with the Russian Federation and the European Union and the US and so on, guaranteeing its existence. So its attempt to join NATO is a violation of this agreement.
Oh,
Okay, other comments? Let's see. Jean, you've had your hand up for a while. If you have a comment, you want to go ahead and chime in. Then we'll have Richard Fallenbaum. But please, Jean, did you want to comment now?
Yes, I just wanted to unmute myself and take care of that. But I just wanted to make one comment. People are saying, well, what's Putin going to do and so forth. And I tell you what he did do is he went to Beijing. He went to Beijing, met with Xi Jinping. They watched the Winter Olympics, watched that wonderful woman, Eileen Gu, win her gold medals and so forth. But then they came out with this statement, which put a very strong relationship between Russia and the People's Republic of China, in which I haven't read the entire 5,000 word document, but I think it's a very important one that's going to have a very big impact on what's going on. And I think Richard mentioned that the two representatives of proletarian power at the present time would be Russia, even though one can question whether it's a socialist country or not. I don't claim it is. But in terms of China, it clearly is, and people don't understand that. And we've had that discussion before. But there is a very strong relationship now between two major powers, and China is increasingly becoming more important. And there's a really interesting book by this guy, Kishore Madhubani. He's from Singapore, and he's a diplomat. And he has a book that says, has the West lost it? And his basic position is the West has basically lost the contest, and but they don't know it yet, and that's the problem. And I think that's the problem. But I think what Putin has done is he established this very close relationship between Russia and the People's Republic of China, and there's no way that the United States is going to win that contest. That's my view. But I just wanted to get that out. There was something else I wanted to say in that regard, but I forget what it is. But I'll put myself back on the stack.
Okay, Richard F., if you want to respond, followed by Raj.
Yeah. On the question of Nazism in the Ukraine, I'm not sure it's a Nazi regime. Certainly, the Nazis played a big role in helping overthrow the government, the regime in Ukraine, and play a role in the government too. But it's I don't think Western imperialism wants a Nazi regime. It's not functional. Nazism is a worn out ideology. I remind you that the current president, who is Jewish and is a Russian speaker, was elected on a platform of peace with the Donbass, overwhelmingly. So the point is that and that was without the votes of the people of the Donbass. They were refused the right to vote, nor of the Crimea, who had already seceded. So the occupied part of the Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for peace, for peace, basically. Okay, So we're going to keep in mind. Somebody said, talked about human rights. Or actually, somebody said Marxists are not supporters of democracy. And I think that's a sort of misunderstanding of where Marxists stand. Marxists don't believe that democracy in the United States is a fraud. It really is not true democracy, and it's a cover for domination of capital. But the working class obviously wants democracy. It wants democracy because most of the people, because the communists, Marxists speak for the overwhelming majority of the population, which are working people, who are oppressed people. So it's a slander to say that communists are not for democracy.
Okay, Raj.
Wait. This is Janet. Richard, I had asked some questions to address to you, and I didn't hear your response.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Do you want me to repeat them?
Yes.
Okay, so one did have to do with human rights and what your take on the bourgeoisie versus proletariat position is on human rights. And the other has to do with, you said that the difference between those two has to do with individual rights, that the bourgeoisie believes in individual rights. But what I was saying is, to me, it's about property rights, not individual rights. That's what's the difference.
Well, in a way, you're right. How could I put it? You can't talk about individual rights, personal rights, outside the framework of the social relations. And if the social relations are exploitive, the individual rights are impaired. And that's the Marxist view of it, that under communism, under capitalism, under the rule of capital and of the property relations and production, you have limited human rights. So the bourgeois concept of human rights is everybody is the same. They put that as an ideology. Well, that's a very nice concept, but in fact, when there are differences in property relations, that kind of equality cannot exist. So that's one way of, I guess there's a lot of other ways of putting it, but that's just my way of putting it right now.
Okay, Raj, you've had your hand up for a while now. If you
that's fine. Yeah,
make your comment.
I think returning to the struggle for power of the working class, this, I think, equating China to being a proletarian dictatorship that Jean represents, I don't agree with. Because proletarian class in China is a contract workers. There are 290 million. They don't get benefits because they work outside and they live in very difficult conditions, just like similar group in India. India is unquestionably a capitalist country, but in China, to call that a proletarian democracy, that means proletarian dictatorship means they are the parties derived from them and that the party represents their interests, but they don't. They are the most exploited of the working class, which are the proletarians. So the idea somehow it is a fight between socialist world on one side and capitalist imperialist world on the other is not quite accurate. in my opinion. What is happening is that there emerged, as Lenin had predicted, that you cannot have a single pole, strong pole of capital. Eventually another pole develops, and that's at the highest stage of development of capitalism, which is imperialism. So that's what happened. The United States reached that stage. It degraded in 1945 due to the war. The stage of capitalism went down from imperialist stage somewhat, economic sense, and then went up again in 30 years because accumulation of capital. It was forced to invest in a country like China, and there developed capitalism. That's run by the party, but it's capitalism. So now this is the contention between two blocs, and they're not at the same stage. And Russia is also a capitalist country, although it's not the same as the Western capitalist countries. They have been forced into an alliance. It's a good thing that they are allied because US has been the wrecking ball of countries. So it's a good thing that they're stopping the United States. That's a good thing. But the point is, if the working class has to win power, you cannot confuse the issue. The Chinese worker, the American workers, and the Russian workers have something in common. That was Lenin's point. And we are sort of saying allying ourselves with countries rather than the class, which is a subject Richard actually addressed to begin with. But then there is some, I think he looks at it differently. He thinks that there is China and Russia represents a working class opposition to US imperialism. I don't share that view, but any of you can comment on that. I think that's inconsistent with both Marx and Lenin.
Okay. Let's see. Well, let me go ahead and I actually want to raise a question to the group. Not meaning to kind of divert the discussion, but just to something I've wanted to raise here. What has been people's experience in talking to others about this issue of Ukraine and what's going on right now, the US military buildup? Has anybody had, what sort of discussions have you been having with other people? What has been revealed to you from those discussions? And I don't mean to kind of shift it away from what we were talking about before, but I did want to raise that question. So if anybody has anything to say on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I think ever since the bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO, there has been an unfortunate tendency of the left to buy in without much criticism of the narrative provided by the State Department, and the State Department, from to their credit, in their point of view, has become more sophisticated and has learned to appeal to liberal sensibilities, but unfortunately, part of the left is buying into this. And part of the narrative after the fall of the Soviet Union is we sort of personifying countries, identifying countries with leaders, demonizing them, and and by demonizing them, taking part of a considerable part of the peace movement to their side. They say, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't have war, but well, we agree with the basis. So that's like loading a gun, handing it, but say, well, I'm not shooting it. So I think that type of attitude is something we must be vigilant about.
Okay, I'm gonna ask Rich and Kit to chime in. You haven't spoken so far, and then Laura, and then we'll get back around to the group. So Rich and Kit, and then Laura.
Hi, this is Kit. Yeah, we have an opportunity here to, hold on, let me turn off my other cell phone.
Yeah, you're
Okay,
echoing.
yeah, I was in the kitchen. Yeah, we have an opportunity here to educate the population about questioning what the Biden administration is trying to do among, I think, Democrats and other folks who are interested in politics, whether they're conscious left or even former communists that we've known. Anyway, I guess there was a couple of, there was a program I listened to yesterday that is popular among friends of mine, and it's off the beaten path, let me put it that way. But there was a person from the military who spoke and who lives in, this was on the radio yesterday, who spoke because he has a home, he's a U.S. military, who has a home in the Ukraine. He's worked with military intelligence, and he actually has witnessed the violence that the Ukrainians, fascists, have inflicted upon Ukrainians in his community. And anyway, he was putting out a view that I think people who don't live there, who are also associated with the military, aren't aware of. So, I mean, he was putting out information that we have put out. So it was really, really interesting to hear that coming from him. Another, I had read an article too about an investor who he's really big on gold, but he's putting out an opinion too that he's very leery of the kind of conflict that's being created by the current administration. And not saying that he's pro-communist, but his angle is that he's concerned about how the devaluation of the dollar is occurring right now. At the same time, all this is happening, and how Russia is, he talked about the impact on Russia's economy. I'm not saying this very, very clearly because I don't have the article in front of me, but he's raising red flags too about what the administration is trying to do. So, I mean, there's opportunities here that we could take advantage of in terms of promoting a pro-peace agenda in this situation. So I just want to put that out, that not all is negatively against us if we play our cards right.
Thank you. Next is Laura, if you would unmute yourself, make your comment. Thank you, Laura.
I just wanted to make a comment following up what Yusuf was saying about how the strategy of demonizing a leader in order to get to the liberals and the progressives. And I think that that's very true, and it has happened a lot in Latin America. A key example, but first I'll say, so that people look at the leader and say, oh, he's acting in an authoritarian way, or they believe organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and things like that, when they attack the leaders of these countries. And I'm thinking of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, and I'm thinking of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, where, again, as someone mentioned about the US sort of installing a leader, Juan Guaido, there's absolutely nothing to justify his being considered the president of Venezuela. But then meanwhile, Maduro and Ortega and others have been successfully attacked, and a number of people who are socialists and along the line, progressive liberal, then believe that stuff and do not look at the results for the people, for the population of those countries. And so they do not consider the people who then oppose the Ortega or Maduro or whoever, do not look at the better education, better healthcare, better roads, better and all of that stuff. And so that, and the human rights, if they're getting money from the US, if they're based in the US or Britain or whatever, then they're following that line. And one other thing was about the, went out of my mind, but that was just something that I wanted to say, that they've found ways to dig into the base of people who are actually in favor of socialism as opposed to capitalism. Over.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to ask Sharon, she hasn't chimed in for a while, to unmute yourself and ask your question, make your comment. Sharon?
Thank you. So I am a member of a Democratic club because I believe communists need to be everywhere. There's been discussion among the leadership of that club via email, long email threads, about possibly writing a statement about the danger of war and the role of the United States, but there's no agreement among that leadership. And some people wanted to simply condemn Putin and Russia, and others want to take a more balanced, so-called balanced approach, which means, kind of like criticizing both sides. And, Putin might be a thug, but the United States is not playing a good role, blah, blah, blah. And it's really, really hard to get people to understand the history, why we're at this point right now, or anything, that I brought up about the history of the recent history of the Ukraine that Richard referred to, and the differences between Eastern Ukraine and Western, and the role of the US in wanting to be hegemonic in the area, in the region. And people, only one or two people responded to that. And it's really an uphill battle in the Democratic Party to take an anti-military and a stance against the buildup toward war. So I think we need to keep raising it and support Bernie Sanders' position, although it's not the best but he is taking a stand, and the few other people in Congress who are, we need to support them. And there's a petition drive, I forget, it might have been Code Pink, but somebody put out a petition to Feinstein and Padilla, criticizing them for not taking an anti-war position. And I think that's important to do. I also wanted to point out that there's a couple people in the chat whose contributions have not been responded to, and I think they should. So NY is talking about how the US would benefit the most from a war, in a ground war in Ukraine. And I think that's an important point. And then EG asks a question about how can, asking for an explanation about how Russia, dominated by a class of oligarchs, is a, quote, center of working class power. And I think that's important to talk about because Russia is not led by a communist party. And yet some of us are saying that there's still working class power there. I think we need to talk about that.
Well, that would be, can somebody respond to that? It's hard for me to follow the chat. So thank you, Sharon, for bringing that up. Anybody want to respond to the question again? Do you want to read it again, Sharon, and then?
Yeah, so EG wrote, can you please explain how Russia, dominated by a class of oligarchs, is, quote, a center of working class power, unquote. So I guess Richard, I believe it was Richard said that.
Well, let me try to broaden the question a little bit instead of just focusing on the question of the character of Russia, tying in how can it play how can it be playing an anti-imperialist role that, you know, brought it out even further. So can somebody respond to that? Richard, anybody?
Well, I can say definitely that the Russian Federation is not a socialist country by any definition. It's a capitalist country. However, I don't consider it an imperialist country. I think calling it imperialist is ultra-left. It is the oligarchs serves a slogan that's being exploited well. When they say oligarch, it means when the State Department or those who support it say oligarch, it means the oligarchs we don't like. The U.S. is dominated by oligarchs. Yes, but in Russia, the class and power, in my analysis, is more of a national bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie that's not utterly tied, it has not utterly tied its fortunes to imperialism and wants some independence. That being said, one must not forget that there's a substantial communist and socialist movement in Russia. The Communist Party is in fact the principal opposition party. It's not small fries, relatively insignificant people who toe the U.S. line. The principal opposition is the Communist Party. However, because of the experience of the Soviet Union, it is difficult that many of the gains of the Soviet Union, social gains, have not been completely dismantled, and if they would be dismantled, there would be a popular resistance to it, and this is something that makes the U.S. Uncomfortable, and it's doing everything to push it to the right or weaken it in other ways. All this being said in the discussion, it should have not forgotten, Russian Federation is a nuclear superpower at par with the U.S. and any confrontation would mean we're closer to nuclear annihilation, and I don't think this should be forgotten.
When we talk about imperialism, we have the example of the United States. How does that compare in the slightest with Russia? It is not an imperialist country, and neither is China.
Go ahead, Richard. Did you want to chime in?
I think EG hits on an important point, which is that the important point is which class is in control. We talk about socialism versus capitalism, but our speaker last week pointed out, Stephen Gowans, that just because there are capitalists in a country doesn't mean that the country is capitalist. So in the case of Russia, it's very hard to disentangle who's in, and even in China, who's in charge, and to some extent there's a class struggle going on in both of those countries. There has to be, if there are, but the question is whether there is a class, a consolidated class, a capitalist class in each country. I would contend that the capitalists did not consolidate themselves into a class and take power in Russia. There was an attempt, with the help of the United States and imperialism, to put them in power, just as there's an attempt in Ukraine now. But I think it failed. But they did a lot of damage, not only to the country, but they exposed the weakness of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which basically surrendered power and capitulated. But I think it's a very complex situation. How do you do that? I think you have to kind of read the tea leaves in that country. Like, what are they doing? They're not functioning as an imperialist country. Well, how can a capitalist country in the current world not function as an imperialist country, or subordinate itself to other imperialist countries? It doesn't make sense to me. The Polish capitalists welcome NATO because they see it as a way of protecting themselves and as a way of helping themselves consolidate their power. Well, why aren't the Russians? Why isn't the Russian state doing that? I mean, they would love it, if they were under the domination of capital, of domestic capital. But I agree, it's hard to disentangle. It's hard, it's hard to come up with a definitive answer.
Okay, can I think we've gotten off into a very focused and interesting and valuable topic. I think Yusuf, E.G. launched it, Yusuf commented, Norma chimed in, now Richard. Can I ask people if there are any comments? Several people have their hands up. Can anybody chime in and speak specifically to this question and try to keep this thread of discussion going? Raj?
Yeah, I will do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with Yusuf and Richard that Russia is not an imperialist country. But my definition of imperialism comes from Lenin. I think there are two interpretations of imperialism. One is one that is militarily very strong, but that's not the heart of it, the matter. The heart of the matter is when you reach a monopoly stage of capitalism. Russia is not in a monopoly stage of capitalism. I think China is more drifting towards that. And the Chinese Communist Party, by the way, has higher ups. The higher you go, they have a lot of investments within these monopoly capitalist firms. So they hold stocks, very large amount of stocks they hold individually. So they're part of the capitalist system, which is a peculiar one. But because if you have working class, you cannot have capitalism working for the proletarians. Otherwise, you throw out Marx's entire work out the window. What does a Marxist group doing here trying to defend capitalism as socialism? Just because a party is in power? Well, if the party could just change things, then capitalism won't be capitalism. Capitalism has an inner drive. Once it comes, it's like cancer. So it's a different stage in China. It's much more, see, they have captured the world market, okay? Imagine what United States was after Second World War. It was captured market, and they were talking about all kinds of liberalism, good things and all that. But that all ended, and now look where we are. We're in a completely decayed stage. China is not in a decayed stage. And I'm glad China and Russia are opposing bloc of United States. Don't get me wrong. I'm not equating the two, but to call that socialism, I think we just basically are saying Marx and Lenin don't matter anymore. And we just, whatever we like to feel is success. That is not true. But I agree with Yusuf's definition and Richard's that Russia is but it's not a socialist country. By no means. You remember, Russia was in G8. G8 were the capitalist countries in which China was not there at that time. And Russia got kicked out because it moved and acquired its place in Crimea, which I think is legitimate. I agree with Richard that that's a legitimate thing, and it all was triggered by the attempt to overthrow the government in Kiev and replace it by these right-wingers. So that threatened Russian interest, which they had legitimately, and there was an agreement that they can have forces and so forth and fleet stationed there. So they couldn't have given that up. And there are Russian people, there are Russian-speaking people in Crimea. So it's a complex issue, I agree. But in terms of imperialism, imperialism is a stage of capital. It is not a question of forces dominating you. I mean, military forces alone. It's a main economic dominance is economic. USA is now becoming a kind of a failed imperialist state. Okay, China is not a failed state. So China is much more healthy, but it is the similar kind of thing, just in a different stage. Thank you.
I'd like to chime in about
Yeah, go ahead, please, Jenny.
Yeah, so what happens to the idea of who owns the means of production? So in a capitalist state, private, but in a socialist communist state, not private. So what about Russia and China when it comes to who owns the means of production?
Can I just ask, I think
I can answer that.
Question, but I'd like to try to keep the focus on on Ukraine and what's going on. If people can try and tie their comments to response to Janet's question back to that, I think that would be helpful. Go ahead, anybody wants to jump in.
Well, the most interesting thing that I have heard is that a Jew has been elected president of Ukraine. I have labored under the notion that what I first was hearing, and then in 2014, that it's been a fascist installation by the West. So now it's not only that he's Jewish, but other things that you're saying about the government there indicate that it's probably more, I don't know about liberal, but it's probably more people bothered than I had been thinking. So I'm very impressed with having found that out. And anybody cares to talk about that, it's more useful than that Ukraine, the idea that Ukraine is being told how to behave by Russia misses the point. Who's being told by Russia and the troops is the West, the invasive West. So
I just wanted to quickly answer Janet's question about ownership of means of production. That is actually in socialism, it cannot be private. Tactically, you could do it in parts of it, as it was done in Russia under Lenin, new economic policy, but very limited time, very limited area, and never threatened the working class power. And but that's crucial. Neither of that exists today in China or in Russia.
There's this constant pretense that there's a rule book of how to do socialism, how to get to socialism and communism. There is no rule book. Anytime we can get around our owner's control of the world is very valuable in putting forward the people. And we can't be limited by, well, we don't have control of production, so forth. The states that are employing any communist intent are further along than they were when they started out, because they have that as an objective. And it's being ignored that the places that are in struggle for socialism are actually benefiting the people who live there.
So is this just a jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, John. I know you guys have had your hands up for a while.
There ought to be some kind of decorum here, Alan.
Yeah. I'm very decorous.
Yeah, I was talking to Alan, who's supposed to be moderating this thing.
Yeah, well,
no.
Please go ahead, Richard. I was just about to try to go back to that.
Okay, thank you. I hope you recognize it as friendly criticism here.
Yeah.
I had 2 points. One is I wanted to get back to points that Janet and Laura both alluded to, and that is that in large measure, I'll use the word socialist movement here in this country has been very much divided, I think, and I think this is a deliberate effort, but it's been divided into the economic Marxism, if you will, and the cultural well, I wouldn't even say cultural Marxism. But the point is that they both alluded to human rights, and I think that this is, and it's going to sound a little conspiratorial, but I think it gets back to Gene Sharp, which I think we should have a program on. He pointed out that one of the ways you abdicate a movement is by appealing to cultural symbols, and I think that in large measure the intelligence community in this country has adopted that. So they have appropriated human rights and divided the movement along those issues. So now you see a Marxist socialism, and you see a cultural socialism, and they're at loggerheads with each other. But I wanted to really get back to what you asked, Alan. You pointed out, and I'm in contact with, like, in particular my sister, who I use as a gauge for as the mainstream Democratic. And I think in large measure they're becoming very tired. I think that they're being hit by the COVID, they're getting hit by the inflation, and now they're being hit by an impending war in Ukraine or impending war in China. And I think that in large measure that they become numb. And I think we really have to somehow address that. And I don't know how. I keep working on her. I really do keep working on her. But we need to start looking at the suburbs, and we need to get into the suburbs and the rural areas, and address their concerns and relate them back to an outsized military budget in this country. So I'll just shut up and pass it back. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask Gene to go ahead, since he's had his hand up for a while, followed by Laura. We're getting pretty close to the end here. I know Raj said that he has to leave. So Gene, if you
okay, thank you, Alan. And we've skipped around a lot, but first of all, just in terms of the socialist movement in this country is very strongly anti-communist. I don't see anything challenging the received dogma about the evils of communism coming from the Bernie movement, who I support, or anyone else. The only ones that do, I think, is the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which I'm sympathetic to. But the left, so-called left in the United States, doesn't provide a source of action in international affairs. The other thing is, I think it's important that we understand the way in which human rights has been weaponized in this country. So when Biden and anyone in the State Department and so forth talks about human rights, well, if they're concerned about human rights, they don't have to leave the city limits of Washington, D.C. to see massive attacks on human rights of American citizens here in the United States. And I think we all understand that. And that's part of the reason why, so many people who, may have been pro-Bernie or whatever are supporting Trump, because they're totally disgusted with the Biden administration, and we need to take that into account. But when you talk about human rights, again, much of what the so-called professional human rights organizations are, they feed into this same ideology. In terms, if you look at China's rights and activities in human rights, for example, everybody's talking about the Xinjiang and so forth, but they just believe totally bogus stories, totally bogus. And there's ways to investigate that. You can read what they say, and then you can read what the Chinese say. You can read what what expatriates who are living in China, Americans, what they say, and you put that all together and arrive at a solution to that. But instead, you don't see that. You don't see that. And I think also in terms of working class, if you look at the Chinese working class, well, the poorest Chinese have seen it better. The average worker in China has seen an 80% increase in his income or her income. And the same is true of the poorest, at least 20%. And those figures are from the New York Times, which certainly is not biased towards China. So I just think a lot of that is totally bogus. And I appreciate Laura's comments in terms of bringing this up to date, because I don't follow Latin America as much as I should. And I appreciate her bringing this into all these attacks on people we consider allies there. And I just note that more recently I saw that China and Argentina have signed an agreement on the Belt and Road Initiative, part of which involves China is talking about the independence of the Malvinas Islands, which many people know as the Faulkner Islands, the islands off Argentina. And again, this is part of British imperialism, and China is supporting the Argentinians on this. So I think the whole landscape of world politics is undergoing change, and we can't, and I appreciate Raj, his knowledge of Lenin and these concepts. However, these things change, and our concepts need to change accordingly. So I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
Okay. Speaking of Laura,
This is Laura.
I was going to call on you. So
Okay, great. Because I actually do have something that started at 12:30,
Yeah.
so I'll need to switch right.
We're going
to
to wrap
that.
up.
So thank you. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that we've had recently that can show what a countries and what their leaders' intentions are is the COVID pandemic and how they responded to that. And China, as we learned in a recent Sunday morning talk, built 10 hospitals or something, and made sure, did everything it possibly could to stop COVID in a country where it started. And so when you look at that, that's the orientation toward their people. And I like the way that I can't think exactly how people have said it, but it's like, is capitalism or capital enterprises, private enterprises, is that being used as a tool to help the people, or are they in charge? And in China, it looks like they're not in charge. If the private had been in charge, they wouldn't have had such a great response to COVID. And again, bringing up Latin America, and then I'll have to sign off, but they had the Belt and Road Initiative from China. Their experience, and I understand that this is true in Africa, although there's been a lot of criticism of China in Africa and in Latin America, but the experience that I've learned about the leadership in Latin American countries is it is very different from the World Bank and the IMF and all of that. What China has done has actually helped the people of the country with the development projects that they've done. So thank you for allowing me to come in and Norma, you always save the chat. If you'll send it to me afterward, that'll be great. Thank you so much, Richard and everybody, for this wonderful time.
Thanks,
you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.
So I think what we're going to do now is, I think Raj said that he had to leave. Let's stop the recording, and people can hang around and keep talking. Some of us have to leave, but I'm going to go ahead and press the stop on the recording.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.